time and key moment as a church, and because we officially begin chapter 12. And it's a key moment because the Gospel of Luke is 24 chapters, and so since we're now entering chapter 12, that brings us essentially now to the halfway point. And so whether that means 5 more years in Luke, I do not know, but I suspect all of us have our suspicions. But whatever the case, this has been just a wonderful study. I hope it has been a blessing to you. I know it's certainly been that for me. In fact, if you could just see it from my perspective, you might even be amazed as to how certain things have unfolded for us as a church over the many years of our journey through this gospel. In fact, I am shocked just about every single week as to how timely and pertinent almost every single passage in the Gospel of Luke has been for us in the various seasons of our church. It's been just a thrilling thing, frankly, to see how the Lord cares for his own in this way, and how he truly feeds his people as he promised he would do, and how he always seems to give a customized word for the season and the moment of the church. And so it's just been a tremendous display, frankly, of divine providence from my perspective, and I could give you literally example after example of that, and how the Lord truly has cared for us and given us timely words in the moments that they're needed. And what is fascinating is that truth of how God always cares for his own just so happens to be the theme of chapter 12. This chapter will now teach how God cares for the needs of his people in every circumstance of life, and always for the purpose of faithfulness. Just an absolutely critical truth to drive down deep into our hearts as followers of Jesus Christ. It is the kind of truth and promise, frankly, that we need to develop a deep conviction for if we're to be faithful to God for all that he would have for us, both personally and as a church. And so look with me, if you would, here just to begin to chapter 12, and we're just going to introduce it this morning with verses 1 through 3. And the emphasis here all the way through verse 12 will be on how to stand firm in the face of opposition, how to stand firm in the face of hostility. Again, Jesus is getting ready to leave not many months from now after his resurrection, and so it will be vital that these disciples know how to battle the temptation to stop believing, to fall away in the face of opposition or persecution. And so what we have here in these first 12 verses of chapter 12 are 5 principles for how to stand firm. In fact, this whole chapter 12 is going to deal with the issues of fear and worry and anxiety and all the various ways of the Christian and the Christian life. But here, coming off of this section on false teachers and hypocritical religion, he wants to teach them to learn how to deal with fear and worry and anxiety that will often arise in the face of opposition, in the face of pressures and persecution. The question will be, how will you stand firm in that day? How will you stand firm in the day of your opposition? How will this church stand firm, potentially in the day of our opposition? That is the critical issue of this passage before us, and it is one that without question will become, I believe, unbelievably important to the church in coming days in this country. And so before we get into it, please simply follow along as I read these verses for you. Again, we're going to be in verses 1 through 3 this morning, but I'm going to read verses 1 through 12 just to help set the context and lay out the scene for us for a little bit. Here's what Luke records under the inspiration of the Spirit. Verse 1 of chapter 12, he writes, "And under these circumstances, after so many thousands of people had gathered together that they were stepping on one another, he, Jesus, began to say to his disciples, 'First of all, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. For there is nothing covered up that will not be revealed, and hidden that will not be known. Accordingly, whatever you have said in the dark will be heard in the light, and what you have whispered in the inner rooms will be proclaimed upon the housetops. So I say to you, my friends, do not be afraid of those who kill the body, and after that have no more that they can do, but I will warn you whom to fear. Fear the one who, after he has killed, has authority to cast you into hell. Yes, I tell you, fear him. Are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 cents? Yet not one of them is forgotten before God. Indeed, the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Do not fear, you are more valuable than many sparrows. And I say to you, everyone who confesses me before men, the Son of Man will confess him also before the angels of God. But he who denies me before men will be denied before the angels of God. And everyone who speaks a word against the Son of Man, it will be forgiven him. But he who blasphemes against the Holy Spirit, it will not be forgiven him. And when they bring you before the synagogues and the rulers and the authorities, do not worry about how or what you are to speak in your defense or what you are to say, for the Holy Spirit will teach you in that very hour what you ought to say. Well, as I read these verses, you might be able to tell that there are various themes that are present. But perhaps you're able to pick up on the fact that the dominant word in these verses is this word of fear. It's the Greek term phobeo, from which we get in the English phobia, sometimes fear. And of course, the associated concepts that are usually related to fear, things like worry and concern, are also present in this text. And so this comes to be a passage about fear. That is the theme. In fact, again, the whole chapter is going to deal with the issues of fear and worry and anxiety and the various arenas of life. But again, the specific focus of these first 12 verses will relate to fear, but in the face of opposition. Fear that arises in the face of persecution, resistance, hostility for the name of Christ and seeking to follow him as Lord. In fact, this passage, again, just given the state of our world and the trajectory of this country, is going to become, I believe, very precious to the church in coming days. There is a sifting that I believe has already begun with the professing and visible church that is obvious. There is the professing church, but then there is within the professing church the true church. In fact, persecution, both biblically and historically, is what has always purged the church of that which is false. It is what has purged the church of all that is fraudulent, all that is hypocritical, all that is fake, or all that is merely professing. There is a great difference between professing Jesus as Lord when there is no cost and the church is merely a happy sort of social experience, and for which there are many personal benefits. There's a great difference between that and then professing Jesus as Lord when there is a cost, when there's a great cost, when there are many costs, when the cost is hard. Which, by the way, is why in chapter 14, Jesus will exhort that you must count the cost, as he says, if you're to follow him. And what is so tragic is how so many will hear those words of Jesus, but then believe themselves to somehow be the exception. And so the moment that some kind of cost emerges, or maybe even just a potential cost, they fall away. And so here is a passage in which Jesus will now teach and instruct the Christian on how to stand firm, how to stand tall and even shine in the midst of opposition. In fact, it's one thing to merely endure and simply survive, but it's a whole other thing to endure well. It's a whole other thing to, in the midst of opposition, actually be a people who produces fruit. There's one thing that the church must come to grips with in light of a coming persecution in this country. It is that God always does his greatest work for the kingdom in the fires of opposition. And I call it a fire because there is a refining work to it. Persecution, again, is what has always purged the church. And because who is willing to suffer for something for which they don't actually believe? Who is willing potentially even to die for something they don't really believe? In fact, even recent experiences like things like the COVID or the race issues have been unbelievably revealing in this country, have they not? You saw literally thousands of churches collapse almost overnight. And yet at the same time, you watched other churches, true churches, faithful churches, explode not only in attendance, but also in seeing people come to faith. In fact, it puts flesh on passages like 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 17, which, of course, is the definitive text on things like that. The apostle there writes these very important words. He says, "For it is time for judgment to begin with the household of God," to begin with the church, to assess the purity of the lampstands. God judges the church long before he judges a nation. In fact, he'll often use the world to be his tool of judgment for the church. And so there are times in which opposition will be thrust upon the church as a result of God's judging hand, but for the purpose of purifying her. This has always been the case historically, to test what is true and to test that which is false, to test who is true and to test who is false, to sift, to make known, to filter out those whose profession of love and allegiance to the Lord Jesus Christ is true, and those for whom the church is, again, merely just some social experience, and for which there may be some temporary benefits, or because it's what their family does. Church has been living in a bubble in this country for over the past several hundred years, but if there is anything that is true, that bubble is in the state of being popped. And the normal experience of the church over the past several millennia, if the Lord does not return, will be the experience of the church in this country. And so while the purpose of this passage isn't to give us a theology of suffering and persecution, understand that that has always been the norm of the church. And because that was to be the means through which God always intended to accomplish his greatest and most fruitful purposes for his kingdom. And so if the king, Jesus, was enthroned literally through death and suffering, then what must that mean for those who desire to enter into the kingdom? Kingdom of God is to be a glorious reality. The scriptures are clear, but in the purposes and the plans of God, what is also clear is that it was always to be erected through the tool of suffering, through hardship, through trial, through persecution. And so hostility and opposition is not actually something to run from, but something to embrace. In fact, again, we saw that in a very small way during COVID with the government shutdowns across this globe. Why did so many churches collapse and die while others thrived? In fact, do you know how many people actually came to faith in those days as a result of a fear of death? It was incredible. And so what was to be the job of the church? What was to be the job of the assembly? Well, it wasn't to hide, it wasn't to close, it wasn't to cower in fear. Rather, it was to stand firm as a beacon of hope. It was to show a different way as ambassadors of the gospel. And so all the true churches, and the sound churches, and the faithful churches were all the ones who ended up baptizing those people. How many churches did we see that refused to even close under threat of punishment and because they had a proper object of fear and understood their divine mandate? And so what Jesus will get his disciples ready for at this point in his ministry is how to stand firm and produce fruit in the midst of opposition, in the midst of hostility. Fruitfulness comes most richly always in the midst of hardship. But in order to produce fruit in the midst of opposition, it presumes you're able to stand in the midst of opposition. And so the way to suffer well is by being prepared to suffer well. And so Jesus here will now begin his preparation. There's been a burden on my heart over the past several years. It is to prepare this church to learn to suffer well. And if you don't understand what is coming from the church, then it is important that you begin to open your eyes. It is important that you read history. It is important that you understand how this world works. It is important that you recognize the patterns of what has always come for the church. There's a testing that is coming. There is a judgment that is coming. There is a refinement. There is a sifting that has already begun. That is obvious. And it almost always comes through hostility and persecution. And if there is one thing that church history teaches us well, it is that in order to suffer well, you must be prepared to suffer well. Amen. Pastors must prepare their people. Husbands must prepare their wives. Moms and dads must prepare their children. It is so easy to joyfully name the name of Christ when you're part of a joyful church and all is well, and there is not yet any cost. But it is a whole different game when you're looking at the prospect of tremendous loss. And in those moments, every single one of us will find out what we truly believe. As to where it is that your convictions and allegiance truly lie. And so the most immediate application of this passage belongs to the disciples. We'll see that here in verse 1. But there are certain principles here that extend to every disciple. And so what we'll see in verses 1 through 12, again, are 5 principles for how to stand firm in the day of opposition. That is the context. This is the Lord's preparation for his faithful. What is it that you must do in the day of your hostility? How is it that you will stand firm and endure well in a way that produces fruit? Well, the Lord here gives 5 key principles upon which you can stand. And so we're only going to cover the first one this morning because it is the basis for all of the other 4, not to mention there are several complex issues in these 12 verses that will take me some time to develop for us. And so we're only going to be in verses 1 through 3 this morning. But first of all, notice, if you would please, the very first principle to understand. And that is that if you're to stand firm in the day of your opposition, you must first of all have a pure heart. That is the first point. You must possess a pure heart. That is to say that you must be true in your convictions of what is true. In the day of hostility, it will not be sufficient to have just merely adopted the convictions of somebody else. Rather, they must be your convictions. Your convictions must be pure, and they must be based on what is true. And so notice again what he says here in verse 1. Luke states these words. He says, "And under these circumstances, after so many thousands of people had gathered together, they were stepping on one another. He began saying to his disciples, 'First of all, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy.'" First point again to observe is that standing firm requires a purity of conviction. Purity of conviction, that is the singular point of these 3 verses. If you have mixed motives, faulty desires, or merely a form of external religiosity or spirituality, it is always exemplified, as he will say, in a life of hypocrisy. The first to fall and to defect from the faith in times of opposition are always those who possess an impure heart, those whose hearts are hypocritical and false. And so before we get into what that means, let me just begin here by setting the scene a little bit and reminding ourselves of where we've been. Remember, Jesus here is coming off of having just dealt with these religious leaders in chapter 11. In fact, the opening phrase there of, notice, "and under these circumstances," that could be translated as literally, "and in the midst of these things," which means that this then is all one long section. It's all just one dynamic event that's running basically from chapter 11 through chapter 13. In fact, notice chapter 13 in verse 1. Luke there says, "Now on the same occasion there were some present." So again, this is all a singular event. And the tone here has been one of judgment. That's what we've been seeing. In fact, he's just issued out those woes on the scribes and the Pharisees back in chapter 11. It will continue to be tones of judgment as we move along. But here in chapter 12, we see now Jesus begin to direct his attention toward his disciples. He's going to use his interaction with the hypocritical leaders of the Judaistic system as a foil for sort of what not to be. Now, we've been seeing the crowds at this point, and that they have become pretty ridiculous. I mean, they're absolutely massive at this point. In fact, notice what he says in verse 1 of chapter 12. He says, "And after so many thousands of people had gathered together that they were stepping on one another." So again, this has become the absolute pinnacle of Jesus' celebrity status. In fact, just to give you some perspective as to the enormity of these crowds, the Greek term that he uses here is the term murios, from which we get myriad. Murios means literally 10,000. Sometimes it's used to speak of just an uncountable number, but in its lexical form, it literally means 10,000. And so what's significant here to understand is that it's written also in the plural, which means then that this is literally tens of thousands of people. And so this has become a crushing mob. These people are trampling on one another. This has become basically a show. This is a suffocating mob where the people are becoming aggressive. This was a day in which there was no amplification system, there were no video screens, and so if you wanted to hear Jesus, you had to sort of elbow your way through the mob, and it was not pleasant, I could imagine. And so the point to understand is that this is a level of popularity that the nation has never seen. This is brand new. This is unprecedented. And so as a result, the reigning religious leadership has become exceedingly jealous, but also nervous of Jesus. This is a man who is now stealing their religious spotlight. He is gaining incredible influence. He's beginning to sway the people away from the centralized power of the Judaistic elites. And so after trying to spread lies and turn the hearts of the people away from Jesus by slandering him and claiming that he does what he does in the power of Satan, Jesus then, you remember, confronted them, we saw, in a very public way. He defeated them quite easily at their game, and then he issued out their 3 separate statements of divine prophetic judgments upon them, again with that statement or that word of woe that we saw in chapter 11. The term woe is always a prophetic declaration of judgment. And so after Jesus indicts the entire religious system, everything from the scribes and the lawyers down to the Pharisees, the hostility is now on. These leaders have rendered their verdict that Jesus has got to go, and so they are resolved at this point to catch him in something, as Luke records. They want him gone, they want to get rid of him, and so the politicking has now begun, verses 53 through 54 of chapter 11. But in the meantime, this pressing mob is still present, verse 1 of chapter 12. And so notice what Jesus does. Instead of giving more attention to the crowds or these who are still wanting to sort of follow him, and again, merely for superficial reasons, they want the healings, they want the miracles, they are in love with the fact that he can create bread from nothing and feed them. In fact, these are those who are merely consumers and for whom when the persecution comes will be the first to abandon him. These are the ones who did not count the cost. These are the ones who did not deny themselves, as Jesus exhorted they must do, and that was necessary in chapter 8. And so he turns now instead to his true disciples, but to get them ready in the light of what he knows is about to come. Again, if the king himself is about to be murdered and persecuted, then how much more those who swear allegiance? And so in light of what he knows is coming, he now begins his instructions for how to stand firm. And again, the first principle here is that if they're to endure in the day of their opposition, then they must have a heart that is pure. Another way to understand it is that you must have a heart and a life that is controlled by a conviction of the truth. That is the principle. It is not enough to merely know the truth. Rather, you must develop an abiding conviction of the truth. In fact, notice how he gets at this. Notice what he says. He gives here in the second half of verse 1 a very important warning. Again, coming off of chapter 11 and using these hypocritical leaders as a foil or as an example of what not to be, he says, "And beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy." Now, I've mentioned many times what the word hypocrisy means. It comes from the word hypocrisis, which historically was a term used to speak basically of a sort of play actor. Just a neutral, secular term that referred to an actor who would play a role on a stage. In fact, it often referred to one who would give speeches with loud gestures, as one lexicon says, but again, always in the context of a play or a skit. And it was always something done by definition before the eyes of watching people. It was always done to gain affection, to gain praise and honor and applause. And it was a fairly noble occupation in this day. It was a very respectful thing to be an actor. But the New Testament then, and specifically Jesus, picks up on the term, but to then apply it to a religious or spiritual setting. And so it comes to be used by Jesus to speak of one who is fake, to speak of one who is fraudulent, to speak of one who's become skilled even in assuming an outward character, playing a part. So they learn the speech, they learn to take on the appropriate actions, the appropriate mannerisms. They learn how to posture themselves. They learn even the right things to talk about. They learn the values of a particular religious community and what they're supposed to say and what they're supposed to do, and of course what they're supposed to project that they're sort of prioritizing in their life. And so while everything looks good and everything looks kosher and looks like they're the real deal on the surface and by all external appearances, the problem is that the entire thing is a sham. It's fake. External conformity, outward religiosity, but void of an authentic and truly transformed heart. In fact, I was telling my Fundamentals of the Faith class the other night, there are many people, I believe, who are skilled at being able to reflect the community that they're part of, their church community. Again, they're able to adopt the speech, they're able to adopt the behaviors, they're able to copy the emphases and copy even the priorities of the church. But the problem is that none of it's being produced from a transformed heart. None of it is a true fruit that's produced from a pure heart. Rather, just like the play actors of old, they're loving to be seen. They're loving to be honored. They're loving to be watched and even become a point of influence, regarded as spiritual. But the problem is that none of it's driven by a desire to bring honor to God. And that was the problem of Jesus with these leaders. In fact, notice, he doesn't actually apply the idea of hypocrisy to the people. Rather, he applies it to the leadership, to the ones who are already in a place of influence, or regarding the Pharisees, at least striving to be in a place of influence. These are ones who pretend to speak for God, but they're only frauds. In fact, Paul picks up on this in his letter to Timothy when he says that all hypocrites are liars and deceivers, and who have seared their own consciences as with a branding iron. Chapter 4 and verse 2. And what is the tragedy of a statement like that? Well, that not even they, the hypocrites, are aware of what has happened to them, right? Not even they're aware of their hypocrisy. And why? Well, because as Paul says, their consciences no longer bother them, and because their consciences can't bother them. It's It's been seared. It's been hardened over. And so there is no longer a mechanism in them to cause them to wrestle at all with what they might actually be before the eyes of their God. Their conscience has become calloused. It's become fixed. They're believing the self-deceiving lie that all is somehow well before their Maker and Judge when all is not well. And so they're totally satisfied. They're perfectly content within their heart. And even after maybe doing a self-examination. And why? Well, because their conscience has become completely corrupt. That's the point. Your conscience is simply that mechanism that God has wired into you. And so if your conscience has become seared or it's become twisted or it's become distorted somehow, then it does you literally no good to do a self-examination of your own heart. And because you will only conclude along the lines of what your conscience has now become. In fact, that's why just so many are not at all bothered with sin in the church. And they become so unbelievably self-justified within their own eyes. Their hypocritical consciences have become permanently twisted and become sealed within a cavern of self-deception where it just keeps believing the lies about itself. And so the hypocrite doesn't think twice. The hypocrite has no anxiety of the soul or turmoil within the soul as to whether or not they stand pure before their God. Their conscience declares to them that of course they're pure. And so the problem for Jesus in this text is that is what is then going on with the leadership of this religious system, which is why it's so devastating. And because if that is the situation of the leadership, then how much more, this is the point, then how much more for all those who have attached themselves to that leadership. I say it often in Luke because it's the drum that Jesus just keeps beating over and over again. But this is why it is so important that you be unbelievably wise and careful and shrewd as to who it is that you choose to be your spiritual leaders, as to who it is that you allow to speak into your life and have influence into your life. Certainly true of leadership, but that is a true thing that you must do for anybody that you would allow to speak into your life. And because, again, so go your leaders or influencers, so goes you. And Jesus warns that there are many blind guides and empty talkers, blind guides who lead other blind people straight into a pit. Luke chapter 6, blind leading the blind. And so notice the real issue here for Jesus. He issues a warning not to beware of the hypocrisy of the Pharisees, but rather, notice, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which obviously here he says is hypocrisy. But notice the emphasis is not upon the hypocrisy itself, rather it's upon the nature of the hypocrisy, which is that it has an unbelievable leavening effect to it, which of course is what makes it so deceptive, so deadly. And the illustration is simple enough to understand, especially if you've done any kind of baking in your life. Leaven is any kind of agent that modifies dough and causes it to rise. And as Paul says elsewhere, all you need is just a little bit leavens the entire thing. In other words, it is not possible to just compartmentalize yeast once it's been introduced. And so the point of Jesus here is so beware of the subtlety of it. This is the point. It's a corrupting influence that's slow and yet will inevitably permeate everything when you have even the slightest interaction. In fact, the warning is so appropriate still even in our day in which we live in a veritable state of ecumenical activity. Ecumenism is the idea of cross-denominational or even cross-religious type of partnerships or work. Jesus would say that we ought to be on extreme guard against that kind of thing. In fact, how many still approach the various religions of the world with a kind of eat the meat, spit out the bones sort of attitude, sort of mentality? And because they think that in it there's some kind of virtue to be gleaned. How many view spirituality as a kind of a la carte where you can just pull from this religion and glean from that practice and pull from that theological stream? That is a very unwise thing to do. There's a permeating effect that with time will corrupt the whole, he says. And so just because a certain religion or a false teacher might say a few things that are true once in a while, or even certain things that appear to be close to the truth, that is not a reason to listen to them just in hopes that there might be some helpful nuggets. That is a reason to be on guard all the more against them. And why? Well, again, because with time, leaven slowly and subtly and without notice permeates all of it. That is the point. And so there's very little wisdom, Jesus says, in opening yourself up to a false teacher within a false system. And again, it is why I say often that sort of thing is so deceptive and so destructive. The more truth presented, the better the deception. You swallow the parts that are true, then the less on guard you're going to be as you begin to swallow the parts that are merely appearing to be true and yet are only false. Again, we live in a day of profound ecumenism, and with the advent even of something like the internet, the leavening ability of falsehood is not only ubiquitous but potent. And what is so tragic, just pastorally speaking, is that there are so many who always believe themselves to be the exception. There always seems to be some who think that they somehow won't be sucked in, or that the yeast of falsehoods won't somehow penetrate into them and therefore begin to corrupt them, which is the entire point of this illustration. Jesus says it will corrupt you. It's slow, it's subtle, it is undetected. That is how falsehood always works. In fact, if you knew it was falsehood, you probably wouldn't swallow it, right? And so Jesus here gives a very strong warning about bumping up against what he calls hypocrites, which, by the way, in the context, is what false religion always is. By definition, it is profoundly hypocritical. And did the Pharisees do some things right? Well, of course they did. And yet notice Jesus here doesn't say, well, then just eat the meat and spit out the bones, does he? He doesn't give a list of good things that they might do, or virtuous things, or helpful practices that they might have for you, and then a list of things that maybe you should try and avoid. Rather, he says here, just avoid it all. The whole thing is hypocritical from literally top to bottom, as we saw. So he says, beware of it all. In fact, it is written here even in the imperative mood, which means that it's been written as a command. It's a command that he states here even in the present tense. And so, in other words, you are to be in the consistent or perpetual or ongoing state of proactively avoiding these people. And so why is the church in our day so compromised and so devastated? Well, it's because so many willfully choose to ignore this overt command of their Lord. It is a command to be obeyed. They say, well, I don't listen to the teaching of that false church, but I, for example, like the music. I don't buy into the system of the whole, but I like the practical insights of that Roman Catholic teacher, for example. I don't adopt their content, but I find the various prayer practices of the Eastern mystics to be a very enriching thing for me, and it's very much enriched my prayer life. Well, the Lord Jesus here gives a command that his disciples are expected to obey. He says again, beware of them. That is to say that you must avoid everything about them. That is the mandate. And again, why? Well, because there is an undetectable leavening effect. It is undetectable. In fact, this term here for beware, it's the term proskeo for some of you Greek people. Literally, you must actively turn your mind and your life from them. It's a term which means to give no heed, to pay no attention, to yield up not even a thought to them. In other words, Jesus says that there is absolutely nothing there. There's nothing helpful, nothing fruitful. It is only deceptive, only corrupting. fact, just to quote it again, as Paul said about those who were eventually persuaded slowly and subtly by the false teachers there in Galatia, he said in chapter 5 and verse 9 of that epistle that just a little leaven leavens the whole lump of dough, right? Just a little bit. You don't need to buy into the whole system. You just need to have a little bit introduced to you. And then you are corrupted. So turn foot and run, he says. Refuse to give even a hear. Refuse to brush shoulders. For if you do, the subtle corruption is sure to come. Sort of like what Jude says in Jude 23, that you are to hate even the garments polluted by the flesh of false teachers. He says you are to fear even their clothing because they're so corrupting and so dangerous. And it's important because, remember, this has everything to do with being able to stand firm in the day of opposition. That is what is at the heart of this. Being able to stand firm in the day of hostility. The point is that if you're not grounded and you're not secured and you're not sure-footed upon the purity of the truth, then you will fall, promise, you will fall in your hour of testing. If there's not a purity of truth or a purity of conviction abiding within you regarding the truth, you will not stand, he says. This is the point. You say, well, I believe that the Lord will keep me. I believe that he always preserves his own. Well, absolutely, he will keep you. Absolutely, he preserves his own. But always, hear this, always through certain means, which in this case is obedience to the command. And so he says that you are to turn foot and run. You are to avoid. You are to be on extreme guard against that which is false. Their falsehoods and hypocritical practices, again, have that leavening effect, and you will, with time, become what they are, slowly, surely, without detection. And so he says, avoid it all. It all permeates. It all corrupts. It all spoils, and no one is the exception. In fact, in verses 2 and 3, Jesus, notice, and gives some explanation to this warning. Notice what he says. He says, for there is nothing covered up, verse 2, that will not be revealed, and hidden that will not be known. Accordingly, whatever you have said in the dark will be heard in the light, and what you have whispered in the inner rooms will be proclaimed on the housetops. Again, what is hypocrisy? Well, hypocrisy is being externally one thing but inwardly another, right? It's pretense, fraudulency, fakery. It's play acting. It's assuming a role. It's projecting a certain kind of spirituality, a certain kind of character, and it's driven in context here by a desire to be seen by men, pulling from chapter 11, which was always the issue with these Pharisees. There are many in Christianity, maybe even in this room, who are believing that they right now stand. They go to church. They put money in a box. They take communion. They've been baptized. They serve. They socialize with the people. They relish in all the various dynamics of good Christian community. But the point to understand is that none of that reveals the authenticity or the purity of the heart. Point here in context is that Jesus says that a day is coming in which the secret things of your life will be revealed. Which is to say that the purity of your heart, hear this, the purity of your heart is never seen when everything is well. The purity of your heart and the truth of what your heart is can only be seen, this is Jesus' point, it can only be seen in the midst of testing, opposition. And because, again, who is willing to suffer in any serious way for that which they don't really believe? And for which no longer offers them temporary benefits? If you're going to survive in the face of opposition, then it requires, Jesus says, that your heart be pure. If you're bumping into shoulders all the time with falsehoods and hypocrites, Jesus warns that you may not stand. You won't have a purity of the truth alone abiding within you, and so therefore your heart won't be pure. You will cave, you will compromise, you will negotiate, you will justify. And so when the day comes that you need to speak forth truth, or the message of Christ, or stand firm and stand boldly, the whole point of Jesus here is simply to say that you will not be able to do it. You're not going to be able to do it because it's not what truly abides within you in a pure way. It never took hold of your heart, he says. In that moment, your heart will be revealed exactly for what it is. In fact, this idea here of whispering in the room is picking up on the idea that within most first century homes, there was an inner room where you would keep all your valuables. And so it's where you'd go if you needed to tell a secret, because most of the houses in the first century world were basically made of mud, and so all of your neighbors could pretty well hear your conversations. That'd be fun. But what he's saying is that a day is coming in which the truth about you is inevitably going to come out. That is the point of the illustration. If you're truly my disciples, in other words, that is what will come out. But if you're not my true disciple, but only right now a pretender or appearing to be my disciple, that too will come out. And it will always come out and be unable to remain concealed in the face of opposition. That is how the truth about you will be made known. In fact, not only will you not be able to conceal it, but you're going to be shouting what you truly believe from the housetops, he says, which is an ancient reference to the place where you'd always make some kind of public announcement. In other words, what will be made known to everyone about you is whether you are really mine. Either your faithfulness to me will be declared or your defection from me will be declared. But regardless, something will be declared. In other words, it'll be a time in which you'll be shown to be pure and true, or it'll be a time in which you'll be exposed as the hypocrite that you really are. That's what he's saying. Your purity will be made known, or your pretending will be made known. Might not be seen now and all is easy and all is well, but it'll be seen in the hour of testing. In fact, in that day, I think about this often, but I have a feeling that there will be many who thought that they stood true and that everybody else thought stood true, but who will only fall. And there will be those who maybe right now live with immense uncertainty about themselves and who feel weak and lack assurance right now, even in times of ease, but who I have no doubt will come forth shining strong and firm in that day. I think there's going to be many surprises. It's going to be a sort of preview of Matthew chapter 7, where all those who thought that they stood firm and did amazing things, even in the name of Christ, will only find out that they never stood and that he never knew them. And because testing reveals, persecution reveals, opposition reveals always who is true and who is false, fire always brings out what is truly there. But whatever the case, the point of Jesus is to say that you cannot stand and you will not stand if you're not right now developing a deep and abiding conviction in your heart as to what is true. Relationships won't keep you in that day. Past experiences won't keep you. Music and emotionalism is not what is going to make you stand. Rather, the only thing that'll keep you is the truth, but the truth must be in you. And it must be abiding by conviction. And Jesus says that you cannot develop a conviction if you're constantly playing around with every false religion or faulty practice or new idea that comes flying into your life. In other words, let me put this into a positive way. Jesus is pretty negative. But he's basically saying, so learn the truth of the word well, but then get some conviction about it. This is what he's saying. It is not necessary to be listening to every new idea or weighing every new thought or every new book or every new practice that comes flying into evangelicalism out of some false sense of unity or charity, or because it just appears to have some new insight. Let me just say this. You don't want something new. You don't want a new insight. You want that which is old and known and tested. It's been passed down from faithful generation to faithful generation and has a track record of making people stand firm. That's what you want. God has given us His Word. His Word is clear. His Word is understandable. His Word is unbelievably definitive. You don't need something new. You don't need something fresh. You don't need a new voice. You just need to be pure in your conviction of what God has already given to His true church. For again, as Jude says in Jude 3, he writes these words. He says, earnestly contend. Again, those are boxing terms in the Greek. Earnestly contend for the faith. That is that body of truth, that apostolic teaching. But earnestly contend for the faith, hear this, that has been once for all delivered to the faithful. In other words, nothing else is coming. There is nothing else to be said. Rather, you are to earnestly fight for the truth that has already been given to the church through the Word of God, through that apostolic teaching inscripturated in the Bible. My hope next time is to work through the rest of this passage. We'll see. But the first 3 verses here are so important because this is the critical foundation upon which the other 4 principles will flow. If you don't have a pure heart in the truth of Christ, and the truth of the gospel is not what authentically controls your mind and your heart in every aspect of your life, then none of these other points are actually going to matter. And so the question for us this morning is, so is the truth of God's word and the gospel of Jesus Christ genuinely and truly and purely your own personal conviction? That is the question. Or is all of this just merely the conviction of people around you? The conviction of somebody else? Your family, your friends, your parents, the preacher, the church you're part of? It is a very important question for you to wrestle with. And it's important because unless your convictions are pure, Jesus is about to say that you will not stand when that day of opposition comes. You will deny, you will compromise, negotiate, find a way to appear as something else, having a foot in both worlds for a while until you ultimately step over the line. And what was formerly covered up about you, again, this is the point of these verses, namely the true state of your soul, it will all be utterly revealed in a moment. What was hidden, and perhaps even to you, Jesus says, will be exposed. Again, it is so easy to have convictions when everybody around you has the same conviction. There is a design to that, but there's more than that. It's much harder to pretend when you're facing a personal cost, true cost. And I want this church to be able to stand. In fact, more than that, I want us to be able to bear fruit as we stand. I want us to be the ones standing on the housetops, proclaiming the truth of Christ, both in word and deed, in the face of profound potential threat to us. And so is your heart pure on these things? This is the question. I ask you who are younger in this room, if your belief right now in the gospel is truly and genuinely your own belief and conviction, or is it merely the conviction of your parents? To some of you who are newer in the faith, is the truth of the gospel and the word of God your genuine conviction? Or have you just fallen in love with the social aspects and relationships that you might have with the wonderful people of this church, which is a very compelling reality? I say to you again that the conviction of other people and the convictions of the community to which you belong will not be sufficient in the day of your opposition. So what do you believe? And do you really believe it by personal conviction? In a day in which so many right now are, quote, deconstructing their so-called faith under massive cultural pressure, have you yourself counted the cost? Have you concluded that you're willing to endure personal harm for the name of Christ? Next time, Lord willing, we'll take a look at how to stand firm. Second of all, it will require that you fear the right thing, verses 4 and 5. Third, it will require that you are convinced of God's person and promises, verses 6 and 7. Fourth, it will require that you keep an eternal perspective, verses 8 and 9, something so important if you're to stand firm in the here and now. And then finally, we'll see that you must be persuaded that God's grace will always perfectly show up for you if you're truly His in the midst of any hostility brought against you. Verses 11 through 12. These are the tactics of Jesus for standing firm in the face of any opposition, but all of it presumes, beloved, that your heart is first of all pure in its own convictions of the truth. So do you believe that the word is true on the inside of you? Or have you merely conformed to it on the outside? As you've perhaps superficially, or maybe as Jesus says, hypocritically, merely copied the faith and behavior of those around you? That is the question. In fact, again, verse 2, there is nothing covered right now that will not be revealed or hidden that will not be known. Context, again, is that persecution as a way of revealing what is true, but there is also a sense in which this carries a very important end times tone to it. And because let's say persecution doesn't come for this generation, the point to keep in mind is that there is still going to be a time in which all things will be made known, right? In fact, this statement sounds awfully close to Ecclesiastes chapter 12, and I'll end on this. Ecclesiastes 12, which says this in verse 13, the very end of the book, it says, and the conclusion, when all has been heard, is fear God. That's the word again that we're going to come back to next time. But fear God, a very key component to true perseverance, fear God and keep His commandments, because this applies to every person. And then here it is, verse 14. For God will bring every act to judgment, everything which is hidden, whether it was good or evil. The most tragic exposure on the day of judgment will not be for the one who overtly denied Christ. It'll be for the hypocritical pretender who thought that they were known by Him. For the one who externally conformed but never had a transformed heart. Maybe the one who did things in public but another thing in private. The one who did one thing externally but was something completely different in the hidden place of their heart. The problem for them will be that their heart will be shown to have been fake since the beginning. They were gospel frauds. Their heart merely produced an incredibly skilled ability to play the part, and even to the point in which they were able to deceive themselves, which is what makes it so tragic. And so what you need to be on that final day is the real deal. What you need to have is a heart that is pure and truly transformed. What you need is a heart that knows the truth but also has a conviction of the truth. And because merely understanding it is not what will make you stand, what will make a person stand is an abiding conviction of the truth. And the only way for that to happen, beloved, is for you to cry out to God and ask Him to make it so. To make that true in you. God is always the only one who can purify the heart and cause your feet to stand upon the rock of truth. And so even now, if you're uncertain, you can simply ask him in the quietness of your own heart to make that true for you. And for the rest of us, may all of us ask God to reveal to us as to what it is that is right now truly abiding within us. May he make it known. And so that in that hour of testing, we might stand, proclaim from the housetop, and become his tool through which fruit will be produced for his kingdom. Next time we'll continue on, Lord willing, but until then, may we do this. May we cry out, and may the Lord reveal what is true.